I didn't notice how my daughter-in-law was substituting the medicine when she picked it up from the pharmacy. The pharmacist winked, and I saw her nigh take this instead. When she realized what had happened, her face turned pale with fear, and her eyes filled with horror. She'll finally get what she deserves. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The fever hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles white against the wood, watching Paul and Nellie sprawled across my leather couch like they owned the place. The TV's blue glow painted their faces as they watched some medieval drama, completely absorbed in fictional bloodshed while I stood there burning up from the inside. "Paul, I need to get to the pharmacy." My voice came out rougher than I intended, scratched raw from the cough that had been tearing at my throat all day. "My temperature's nearly 104. He didn't even turn his head, just shifted his weight, adjusting the throw pillow behind his back, my throw pillow, on my couch, in my living room. "Not now, Dad. We're watching the season finale." The casual dismissal hit harder than any physical blow. I pressed my palm against the wall, feeling the house I'd worked 40 years to pay for, feeling the sweat soaking through my pajamas. My breathing came in short gasps, each one sending fire through my chest. The TV volume seemed to mock me. Some queen on screen talking about power and betrayal, while my own son couldn't spare 5 minutes to help his dying father. "Please," I tried again, my voice barely above a whisper. "The pharmacy closes in 30 minutes. Nellie finally looked up, her eyes reflecting the screen's light like a cat's. She rolled them with theatrical exaggeration before turning back to the show. "It's not like you're actually dying, Ray. Take some aspirin." The words hung in the air like poison. Here I was, shaking with fever, probably looking like death warmed over, and my daughter-in-law, Dee, the woman I'd welcomed into my home, the woman I'd helped support for 3 years. Dee couldn't be bothered to show an ounce of concern. Paul just nodded along, his attention already back on the screen where dragons soared over burning cities. I thought about all those nights I'd worked double shifts at Morrison's auto shop, coming home with oil under my fingernails and aches in every joint, just to make sure Paul had everything he needed. The college fund I'd built penny by penny, the wedding I'd helped pay for when Paul lost his job the first time, the house I'd opened to them when they couldn't make rent on their apartment. "You've been living in my house rent-free for 3 years." The words erupted from somewhere deep in my chest, hot and bitter. Paul's head snapped toward me then, his face twisting with irritation. Here we go again with the guilt trips. Guilt trips? I stepped into the room, my legs unsteady, but my anger giving me strength. "You haven't paid a dime toward utilities, groceries, or mortgage. You haven't even looked for a job in 6 months." "The job market is tough, Dad. You wouldn't understand." Wouldn't understand. 40 years of waking up at 5 in the morning, of burning my hands on hot engines, of crawling under cars in the middle of winter D, and I wouldn't understand hard work. I stared at my son, this man I'd raised, this stranger who'd taken my generosity and turned it into entitlement. The fever made everything feel surreal, like I was watching this scene from outside my body. The comfortable living room I'd furnished piece by piece over the decades suddenly felt foreign. The family photos on the mantelpiece, Paul's graduation, his wedding day, Christmas mornings when he was small and still looked at me like I hung the moon. They all seemed to belong to someone else's life. Nellie made a show of pausing the TV, sighing heavily as if we were interrupting something vital to national security. "Can we please finish this discussion after the episode? We've been waiting all week to see how it ends." All week, they'd been planning this evening of entertainment while I'd been fighting this fever, trying to take care of myself because clearly no one else would. The medicine cabinet upstairs was empty. I'd used the last of the cold medicine 2 days ago. The pharmacy would close soon, and then I'd be stuck suffering through the night with nothing but aspirin and their complete indifference. "Why should you rush anyway?" I heard myself saying, the words spilling out before I could stop them. The fever was making me reckless, stripping away the careful politeness I usually maintained with them. "You'll inherit this house eventually." That got their attention. Paul's eyebrows shot up, and even Nellie leaned forward slightly. But I was just getting started. The dam had burst, and 40 years of careful saving, of sacrifice, of building something to leave behind, came pouring out. Plus the 200,000 in savings. The silence that followed was different from before. The TV continued its soundtrack of clashing swords and dramatic music, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. I could see Nellie's mind working, calculating, her eyes suddenly sharp and focused in a way they'd never been when I was just the old man providing free housing. Paul opened his mouth to speak, but I was already turning away, my energy spent, my revelation hanging in the air like smoke from a battlefield. My legs felt like water, and I knew I needed to get upstairs before I collapsed, right there on the hardwood floor I'd refinished with my own hands 10 years ago. The stairs loomed ahead of me like a mountain to climb, and behind me I could hear the whispered conversation beginning, urgent and calculating, as the true weight of what I'd just revealed began to sink into their greedy minds. The whispered conversation stopped the moment my foot hit the first step. I gripped the banister, my knuckles aching from the pressure, and turned back to look at them. They were sitting up straighter now, no longer the lazy sprawl of moments before. The medieval drama played on, forgotten, while a different kind of calculation took place in my living room. "Dad, wait!" Paul's voice had changed, taken on that careful tone he used when he wanted something. "Maybe we were a bit hasty. If you're really feeling that bad—" Too little, too late. The concern in his voice was as transparent as glass, and just as fragile. I could see right through it to the dollar signs dancing in his head. $650,000. D. That's what I'd just handed them, the knowledge of exactly what they'd inherit when I was gone. Nellie had muted the television now, her full attention focused on me for the first time in months. She tucked her legs under herself, leaning forward with sudden interest. "Ray, you know we care about you. We're just stressed about money lately." Stressed about money. The irony would have been funny if I wasn't burning up with fever. They lived rent-free in a house worth $450,000. 8 groceries I paid for, used utilities I covered, and they were stressed about money. Meanwhile, I'd worked until my hands were permanently stained with motor oil, and my back was curved from decades of bending over engines. "How much exactly did you say was in savings?" Nellie's question came out too casual, too practiced. She was trying to sound concerned rather than calculating, but I'd been around long enough to recognize greed when I heard it. The fever made everything crystal clear, like looking through water that had suddenly settled. I could see the shift in their body language, the way they were both oriented toward me now instead of the screen, the way Paul was running his tongue over his lower lip. D, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood when he was plotting something. The way Nellie's eyes had sharpened, losing that glazed look of boredom they'd held all evening. 200,000, I repeated, my voice hoarse but steady. 40 years of saving, working overtime when other men were home with their families, missing Paul's Little League games to fix Mrs. Henderson's transmission for the 3rd time because she couldn't afford to take it to the dealership. Paul had the grace to look uncomfortable at that last part. He remembered those games, remembered scanning the bleachers for me and finding empty space. But discomfort wasn't the same as shame, and it certainly wasn't the same as gratitude. "And the house is worth what now?" Nellie pressed, no longer bothering to hide her interest behind fake concern. "Assessed at $450 last year." The numbers felt heavy in my mouth, numbers that represented decades of mortgage payments, of choosing the house payment over a new car, of eating hamburger instead of steak so I could build something lasting. Something to leave behind for the son who couldn't be bothered to drive me to the pharmacy when I was sick. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sounds of battle from the forgotten television show. But the real battle was happening right here in my living room, and I was finally starting to understand the stakes. This wasn't about cold medicine or television shows. This was about respect, about what I'd become in their eyes. D, not a father or provider, but an obstacle standing between them and their inheritance. Paul cleared his throat. "Maybe we could discuss this more when you're feeling better. You know, make some plans for the future." Plans for the future. My future, which in their minds was apparently very short. I watched Nellie nod enthusiastically, her eyes bright with something that definitely wasn't concern for my health. They were already spending my money, already dividing up my life's work between them. The fever spiked again, sending chills down my spine despite the heat radiating from my skin. I needed to get upstairs, needed to lie down before I collapsed. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I'd just witnessed: the transformation of my son and daughter-in-law from lazy freeloaders into eager vultures, circling around what they saw as their rightful inheritance. "Get your rest, Ray," Nellie said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We'll talk about everything tomorrow when you're feeling stronger." Tomorrow. When I'd be one day closer to the grave, they were obviously eager for me to occupy. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady, and began the long climb upstairs. Each step felt like lifting weights, my legs trembling with the effort. Behind me, I heard the television being turned off completely. The first time in months they'd chosen a family discussion over entertainment. The irony wasn't lost on me that it took revealing my death benefits to get their attention. 40 years of love, sacrifice, and support couldn't compete with two numbers, 450,000 and 200,000. That was my worth to them now. Not as a father, not as the man who'd worked himself nearly to death. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed. 8 p.m. in angry red numbers. 45 minutes since this nightmare began downstairs. 45 minutes since I'd learned exactly what I meant to my own family. The fever had climbed higher, I could feel it in the way my thoughts jumped around like grasshoppers, in the way the room seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. I pulled the comforter up to my chin, but it did nothing to stop the chills that racked my body. The sheets beneath me were already damp with sweat, and I knew this was going to be a long, brutal night, if I survived it at all. At my age, with my heart condition, pneumonia could finish what 40 years of hard labor had started. The thought brought no self-pity, only a strange clarity. I'd always known I wouldn't live forever. 68 years was more than some got, and I'd packed plenty of living into those decades. But lying there, burning up with fever while the people I loved most in the world calculated my net worth downstairs, I realized I'd been a fool. Memories crashed over me in waves, each one sharp as broken glass. Paul, at 18, accepting the keys to the used Honda I'd bought him for graduation. Not a thank you, just a complaint that it wasn't the Mustang his friend Tommy got. That should have been my first clue, but I'd made excuses. He's young, I told myself. He'll appreciate it when he's older. The college bills came next. $80,000 over 4 years money that could have bought me a comfortable retirement. Maybe even a small cabin by the lake, like I'd always dreamed about. Instead, I'd worked every weekend, taken every overtime shift Morrison offered, until my hands were so stiff I could barely grip a wrench by Sunday evening. All so Paul could get his business degree and make something of himself. Except he never did make something of himself. The degree hung on his bedroom wall, downstairs, My bedroom wall now, I supposed, since he'd moved back in 3 years ago with his wife and their grand plans that never materialized. 3 years of just until we get back on our feet that had become a permanent arrangement. My wedding gift to them had been $25,000. $25,000 I'd scraped together by refinancing this house, by taking on debt I'd sworn I'd never carry again. I remembered Nellie's squeal of delight when I handed them the check. Remembered how she'd hugged me and called me the best father-in-law in the world. The best father-in-law. Right up until she needed me to be quiet so she could watch television while I suffered with a fever that might kill me. The clock now read 8:15. Time moved differently when you were this sick, stretching and contracting like rubber. I tried to calculate how much money I'd spent on them over the years. The college tuition, the wedding, the countless smaller gifts, the 3 years of free housing. Over $150,000 easily. Maybe closer to $200,000 when you factored in utilities, food, insurance. $200,000 of my life's work, handed over without question because I'd believed in family. Because I'd thought that taking care of your children was what good fathers did, even when those children were grown adults who should have been taking care of themselves. The fever spiked again, and I found myself thinking about my own father, dead at 55 from a heart attack brought on by too many 14-hour days in the steel mill. He'd never had the luxury of retirement, never saw a fraction of the money I'd managed to save. But he'd taught me the value of work, the importance of providing for your family, no matter the cost to yourself. What would he think of me now, lying here like some kind of victim while my son and his wife plotted downstairs? Would he tell me I'd been too soft, too generous? Or would he understand the hole that opened up in a man's chest when he realized his sacrifices meant nothing to the people he'd made them for? My breathing was getting worse, each inhale feeling like I was drowning in my own lungs. The medicine cabinet was empty, the pharmacy was closed, and the two people who should have cared most about whether I lived or died were probably still downstairs, figuring out how to spend their inheritance. The thought that struck me then was so clear, so obvious, that I wondered why it had taken me this long to see it. They didn't want me to get better. My illness, my potential death, was convenient for them. Profitable, even. Why encourage me to see a doctor when every day I lived was another day they had to wait for their payday? I checked the clock again. 8:45. The long night stretched ahead of me, full of fever dreams and the bitter taste of betrayal. But somewhere in the haze of illness and disappointment, something else was growing. Something harder than hurt, colder than fever. They wanted to inherit my money? They wanted to cash in on 40 years of my labor? Fine. But they were going to earn every penny of it. 3 soft knocks interrupted my fevered thoughts. The sound barely registered at first. Just another phantom noise in my overheated brain. But then it came again, more insistent, and I heard Nellie's voice through the wooden door. "Ray, can I come in?" Something in her tone had changed completely from an hour ago. Gone was the dismissive irritation, replaced by what sounded almost like genuine concern. I struggled to sit up against my pillows, the movement sending waves of dizziness through my skull. "Come in," I managed to croak. She entered slowly, closing the door behind her with unusual care. The harsh overhead light made her squint as she approached my bed, and I noticed she'd changed from her lounging clothes into jeans and a sweater, like she was preparing to go somewhere. "Ray, I changed my mind. Let's go to the pharmacy." The words hung in the air between us, so unexpected I wondered if the fever was making me hallucinate. I blinked hard, trying to focus on her face in the lamplight. She looked different somehow, more alert, more focused than I'd seen her in months. "Really?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. "Thank you, Nellie." She moved to the edge of my bed and sat down, the mattress dipping under her weight. When she reached out to touch my forehead, her hand was surprisingly cool against my burning skin, but something about the gesture felt practiced, almost clinical, like she was checking my temperature rather than offering comfort. "You're burning up," she said, though I caught her eyes darting around the room, taking in the family photos on my dresser, the jewelry box that had belonged to my late wife, the oak furniture I'd bought piece by piece over the decades. "We need to get you some medication before this gets worse." The concern in her voice sounded genuine enough, but there was something underneath it I couldn't quite identify. An urgency that seemed to have nothing to do with my health, and everything to do with something else, entirely. "I'll help you get dressed," she continued, already moving toward my closet. "Paul's watching TV downstairs. He doesn't even know I'm up here." That last comment struck me as odd. Why would it matter whether Paul knew she was helping me? But my thoughts were too jumbled by fever to pursue the question. Instead, I focused on the simple miracle that someone finally cared enough to help me get the medicine I needed. She pulled a thick sweater from my closet, then found my jacket hanging on the back of my desk chair. Her movements were efficient, purposeful, like she'd thought this through. But thought what through? Helping the sick old man get to the pharmacy shouldn't require strategic planning. "Can you manage to get dressed, or do you need help?" She turned back to me, holding the clothes. "I can manage." The idea of Nellie helping me dress was more uncomfortable than struggling into my clothes alone. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, and the room spun like a carnival ride. She steadied me with a hand on my shoulder, and I was grateful for the support, even as something nagged at the back of my mind about her sudden transformation. Getting into the sweater took longer than it should have. My hands shook as I fumbled with the sleeves, and twice I had to stop to catch my breath. Through it all, Nellie waited patiently, even helping me find my wallet and insurance card when I couldn't remember where I'd left them. "The pharmacy at Health Plus stays open until 10, she said as I struggled into my jacket. "We'll make it with time to spare." Health Plus. The downtown pharmacy where I'd been getting my prescriptions filled for the past 15 years. Stephen, the head pharmacist, knew me by name, always asked about my garden and my old car troubles. It would be good to see a familiar face, someone who might actually care whether an old man lived or died. I really appreciate this, Nellie. I looked at her directly, trying to read whatever was behind her sudden kindness. I know you and Paul were enjoying your show, she waved dismissively, but I noticed her jaw tighten just slightly. Shows can wait. Family comes first. Family comes first. The words would have meant everything to me an hour ago. Now, spoken in this room where I'd lain forgotten and fever-racked while they watched television downstairs, they rang with a hollow quality that made me uneasy. But what choice did I have? I was too weak to drive myself, too sick to wait until morning, and too desperate for relief to question why someone who'd been callously indifferent 30 minutes earlier was now playing the role of concerned family member. "Ready?" she asked, offering her arm for support. I nodded, though ready was hardly the word for how I felt, more like desperate enough to accept help from someone whose motivations I couldn't understand. As we moved toward the door, I caught a glimpse of us in the dresser mirror, a sick old man leaning on a woman half his age, both of us heading into the night for reasons that went far deeper than a simple pharmacy run. She helped me to the top of the staircase, her grip firm and steady on my arm. The stairs stretched below us like a treacherous mountain path, and I knew the descent would take every ounce of strength I had left. The journey down the stairs had drained what little energy I had left. By the time Nellie helped me into the passenger seat of my own Ford, I was gasping like I'd run a marathon. She adjusted the mirrors with practiced efficiency. She'd been borrowing my car for months while Paul's sat broken in the driveway, and pulled out of my driveway into the October night. Light rain had started while we were inside, creating halos around the street lamps and making the familiar neighborhoods look foreign and dreamlike. The heater hummed quietly, fighting off the autumn chill that seeped through the old car's weathered seals. For the first few blocks, Nellie drove in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. I noticed her checking the rearview mirror every few minutes, though the streets behind us were mostly empty. Her nervous energy filled the small space between us, making the air feel thick and charged. "How long have you been feeling this sick?" she asked finally, her voice cutting through the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. 3 days, maybe 4. The words scratched my throat raw. Started as just a cold, but it got worse fast. She nodded, but I caught her glancing at me sideways, studying my profile in the dim light from the dashboard. "Have you been taking anything for it?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something in her tone made me cautious. "Just aspirin. The medicine cabinet's been empty for a while." Another glance in the rearview mirror, another adjustment of her grip on the wheel. We turned onto Jefferson Street, heading toward downtown Springfield. The familiar route should have been comforting, but Nellie's increasingly erratic driving put me on edge. She'd hesitate too long at stop signs, then accelerate too quickly, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. "Ray," she said, her voice taking on a different quality, more direct, less concerned with my comfort. "Is the will from 2020 really made out to us?" The question hit me like cold water. I turned to look at her fully, trying to read her expression in the shifting light from passing street lamps. Her profile was set, determined, nothing like the caring family member who'd helped me down the stairs 20 minutes earlier. "Why would you ask that?" I kept my voice neutral, but my heart began beating faster, and not just from the fever. "I'm just curious." She shrugged, but the gesture looked forced. "I mean, after all these years of Paul and me living with you, I wondered if you'd made it official." Made it official. Like their 3 years of rent-free living had been some kind of audition for my inheritance. Like the 40 years I'd worked to build something worth leaving behind was somehow their right, rather than my gift. "How much exactly do you have in the account?" The question came out more urgent than her casual tone suggested. Now I knew something was wrong. The woman who'd shown fake concern for my fever was gone, replaced by someone calculating and direct. I studied her profile as we passed under another street lamp, noting the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers drummed against the steering wheel. "That's not your business, Nellie." My answer clearly wasn't what she'd hoped for. Her knuckles went white against the dark steering wheel, and she checked the rearview mirror again, the fourth time in as many minutes. What was she looking for back there? Or was she simply buying time to figure out her next approach? "I'm not trying to be nosy," she said, but her voice had an edge now. "It's just that Paul and I have been wondering about our future, you know? We can't live in your house forever." But they could, apparently. 3 years of just until we get back on our feet suggested they were perfectly comfortable with the arrangement. This sudden concern about their future had nothing to do with independence, and everything to do with the numbers I'd foolishly revealed downstairs. The rain was picking up, drumming against the roof of the Ford with increasing intensity. The sound should have been soothing, but it only added to the claustrophobic feeling building inside the car. We were alone on dark streets, heading toward a pharmacy that would close in less than an hour, and the woman driving was asking questions that made my skin crawl. "We're family," she continued when I didn't respond. "Shouldn't we talk about these things openly?" Family. The word had lost all meaning tonight. Family members didn't interrogate sick relatives about their bank accounts. Family members didn't ignore desperate pleas for help, then suddenly change their minds and start asking about inheritance details. "Some things are private," I said, my voice firmer despite my physical weakness. She fell silent then, but the tension in the car ratcheted up another notch. I could practically hear her mind working, calculating, trying to figure out another angle. The comfortable familiarity of the drive, a route I'd taken hundreds of times over the years, felt ominous now, like we were heading toward something much more dangerous than a simple pharmacy visit. Downtown Springfield appeared ahead of us, the commercial district's bright lights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness. The Health Plus Pharmacy's neon sign glowed like a beacon, promising relief in the familiar face of Stephen, the pharmacist who'd been filling my prescriptions for years. But as Nellie pulled into the parking lot, her questions still hanging in the air between us, I realized that getting my medication might be the least important thing that happened tonight. The transition from the Ford's dim interior to the pharmacy's bright fluorescent lighting was jarring. I squinted against the harsh glare as Nellie held the door open for me, the warmth inside immediately fogging my glasses. The familiar smell of antiseptic and packaged medicine should have been comforting, but the tension from our car ride followed us through the automatic doors. Health Plus at night had a different atmosphere than during busy daytime hours. Only a few customers wandered the aisles, an elderly woman comparing vitamin bottles, a young father with a crying baby picking up formula. The place felt hollow, echoing with the hum of refrigeration units and the soft beeping of the register. Stephen looked up from behind the pharmacy counter as we approached, his professional smile genuine despite the late hour. At 55, he'd been working at Health Plus longer than most people stayed at any job, and his competence showed in every efficient movement. "Evening, Ray. You're looking a bit under the weather." His observation was kind but clinical, the trained eye of someone who'd seen thousands of sick people over the years. "Bad case of whatever's going around." My voice sounded foreign even to myself, rough and weak. "Need something stronger than what I've got at home." Stephen nodded, already reaching for his consultation forms. "Let's see what we can do for you. Any allergies I should know about? Current medications?" I answered his questions as best I could, my fever-addled brain struggling to remember details that should have been automatic. Through it all, Nellie stood beside me, silent but alert, her eyes moving between Stephen's preparations and the medicine bags he was assembling. "Antibiotics for the chest congestion, fever reducers, and something to help you sleep," Stephen explained as he worked. "That should knock this thing out in a few days. Total comes to $35. $35. Such a small amount for what felt like a lifeline. I reached automatically for my back pocket, then stopped cold. My wallet wasn't there. I patted my jacket pockets frantically, my heart sinking as I realized what had happened. "I'm sorry," I said, embarrassment heating my already flushed face. "I think I left my wallet in the car." Stephen's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight concern in his eyes as he took in my obvious distress. Nellie, meanwhile, had gone very still beside me, her attention focused on the bags of medicine Stephen had prepared. "I'll be right back," I told them both, already turning toward the door. "Just give me a few minutes." The walk to the parking lot felt longer than it should have, my legs unsteady on the wet pavement. The October air cut through my jacket, making me shiver despite the fever still raging through my system. I fumbled with the Ford's door handle, my hands clumsy with illness and frustration. The wallet was exactly where I'd expected, in the jacket I'd changed out of upstairs, the one now lying across the passenger seat. I grabbed it quickly, checking to make sure my insurance card and credit cards were still inside. Everything seemed in order. The return trip to the pharmacy took longer than the walkout. Each step required conscious effort, and by the time I reached the automatic doors, I was breathing hard again. Through the glass, I could see Nellie still standing near the pharmacy counter, Stephen moving around behind it, organizing something. The fluorescent lights seemed even brighter after the darkness of the parking lot, making spots dance in front of my eyes as I approached the counter. Stephen was there with my bags of medication exactly as I'd left them, but something felt different about the atmosphere. Nellie's posture was more rigid, her smile too bright when she saw me returning. "Find it okay?" she asked, though her eyes didn't quite meet mine. "Right where I left it." I pulled out my credit card, grateful to finally complete this simple transaction that had somehow become so complicated. Stephen processed the payment with his usual efficiency, but I noticed him glancing between Nellie and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Professional concern, perhaps, or maybe just the natural wariness of someone who'd worked late-shift retail long enough to develop instincts about unusual situations. "Take the antibiotics with food," he advised as he handed me the receipt, "and don't skip doses even if you start feeling better. The fever reducers you can take every 6 hours as needed." Standard instructions delivered in the same calm tone he used with every customer. But something in his eyes suggested he had more to say, something that wouldn't wait for a more convenient time. As I reached for the medication bags, Stephen's hand briefly covered mine, his touch deliberate and meaningful. His eyes met mine directly, cutting through the fever haze with unexpected intensity. "Ray," he said quietly, his voice dropping low enough that only I could hear, "I think we need to talk." The credit card machine beeped as I slid my card through the reader, but Stephen's eyes never met mine. Something fundamental had changed in the 3 minutes I'd been gone. The easy professionalism had vanished, replaced by an almost painful awkwardness that made my skin crawl despite the fever. He processed my payment mechanically, his usually steady hands fumbling with the receipt printer. The clicking sound seemed amplified in the fluorescent-lit space, each mechanical noise highlighting the uncomfortable silence that had settled between us like fog. "Here's your receipt," Stephen said quietly, his voice stripped of the warmth he'd shown earlier. He glanced up at the security cameras mounted near the ceiling, then back down at the counter, anywhere but at my face. Nellie had moved closer to the pharmacy entrance while I was outside, positioning herself near the automatic doors like a runner waiting for the starting gun. She checked her phone twice in 30 seconds, then looked at me with an expression that was supposed to convey concern but felt more like impatience. "We should get going," she said, her voice pitched higher than normal. "You need to get home and rest." The urgency in her tone struck me as excessive. Yes, I was sick, but the 10 minutes we'd spent here wasn't going to make or break my recovery. Yet she seemed almost frantic to leave, shifting her weight from foot to foot and glancing repeatedly at the exit. Stephen handed me the medication bags, and our eyes finally met for just a moment. What I saw there made my stomach clench with something that had nothing to do with illness. Fear, guilt, and something else, a kind of protective concern that seemed wildly disproportionate to a simple pharmacy transaction. "Take care of yourself, Ray," he said, and the words carried weight that made no sense in context. The bags felt heavier than they should have in my hands. 2 small containers of pills, maybe a bottle of cough syrup. Nothing that should require this level of careful handling. Yet Stephen had placed them in my hands like they were made of glass, with a gentleness that suggested something precious or dangerous. "Thank you," I managed, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. We turned toward the exit, Nellie practically herding me along with subtle touches to my elbow and shoulder. Behind us I could hear Stephen moving around the pharmacy counter, but his usual efficient rhythm was off, too quick, too nervous, like someone cleaning up evidence. The automatic doors opened with their familiar whoosh, and the October night air hit my fevered skin like a shock. But as we stepped toward my Ford in the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was carrying something far more significant than medicine in these innocuous white bags. Nellie walked slightly ahead of me, her pace quick and determined, despite my obvious weakness. She had the car keys ready before we'd even left the pharmacy, which struck me as odd since I'd been holding them during our first trip. When had she taken them from me? The parking lot felt different now, more isolated, more threatening. The few other cars scattered across the asphalt looked abandoned, and the sodium vapor lights created harsh pools of yellow illumination separated by deep shadows. Everything looked the same as when we'd arrived 20 minutes earlier, but something essential had shifted. As we approached the Ford, I caught Nellie glancing back toward the pharmacy's bright windows. Stephen was visible behind the counter, and even from this distance I could see him watching us leave. His posture was tense, alert, like someone waiting for something terrible to happen. "Are you feeling any better?" Nellie asked as she unlocked the car doors, but her tone suggested the question was perfunctory, rather than concerned. "About the same." I climbed into the passenger seat with effort, my legs shaking from the brief walk. The medication bags rustled as I settled them in my lap, and I found myself holding them more carefully than I had moments before. Something was wrong, not just with my illness, not just with Nellie's strange behavior, but with everything. The pharmacy visit that should have been a simple solution to my problem had become something else entirely. A transaction loaded with undercurrents I couldn't identify but definitely felt. As Nellie started the engine and backed out of the parking space, I looked once more toward the pharmacy windows. Stephen was still there, still watching, his face illuminated by the harsh, fluorescent lighting. He raised one hand in what might have been a farewell gesture, but his expression suggested something closer to an apology. "Wait!" Stephen's voice cut through the night air like a blade, stopping us just as we reached the Ford's doors. I turned, my fevered brain struggling to process why the pharmacist was running across the parking lot toward us, his professional composure completely abandoned. "Wait! Your daughter-in-law switched the pills!" The words hit me like physical blows. I staggered against the car's frame, my weak legs nearly giving out as the meaning sank in. Nellie had gone completely still beside me, her hand frozen on the door handle, her face a mask of calculation in the sodium vapor lighting. Yet Stephen reached us, breathing hard, his eyes darting between Nellie's rigid form and my shocked expression. I saw everything on camera. She replaced the antibiotics with something else. Everything. The cameras had recorded everything. My 3-minute absence, Nellie's opportunity, whatever she'd done to the medication while Stephen was momentarily distracted. The evidence existed, captured in digital clarity on the pharmacy's security system. "That's impossible," Nellie said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was thinking fast, trying to find an angle, a way to turn this revelation to her advantage, or at least minimize the damage. Stephen ignored her completely, focusing on me with an intensity that cut through my fever haze. "Ray, I prepared your actual medications when you went to get your wallet. The antibiotics, fever reducers, everything you need." He held out a new pharmacy bag identical to the ones I was holding. "Take these real medications instead." The bags in my hands suddenly felt radioactive. Whatever Nellie had substituted for my antibiotics was still there, waiting for me to take them, trusting that they would help rather than harm. The woman I'd welcomed into my family, the woman I'd supported for 3 years, had tried to poison me. "I don't understand," I said, though I was beginning to understand far too well. The inheritance numbers I'd revealed in my fevered anger, Nellie's sudden change from indifference to concern, her probing questions during the car ride, her nervous behavior in the pharmacy, it all made horrible sense now. She took advantage of the moment when I stepped away from the counter. Stephen continued, his professional training keeping his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was revealing. "The security cameras show her opening your medication bags and switching the contents." Nellie had finally found her voice, and her response was pure calculation. "This is ridiculous. Why would I do something like that? Ray's family, I want him to get better, not worse." But even as she spoke, I could see the defeat in her eyes. Stephen had evidence. The cameras had seen everything. Her plan, whatever it was, had failed before I'd even left the pharmacy. "How long have you been planning this?" The question came out of me without conscious thought, my mechanical mind trying to understand the timeline, the logistics of attempted murder. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. I could piece it together myself now. The change in her behavior after learning about the inheritance, the sudden offer to help, the interrogation about my will during the drive. She'd formed this plan in less than 2 hours, moving from greedy curiosity to attempted murder with terrifying efficiency. Stephen placed the bag of real medications in my shaking hands. These are what I originally prepared for you. The other ones... He gestured toward the bags I'd been carrying. I don't know what she put in there, but I know it wasn't antibiotics. The night air felt colder suddenly, cutting through my fever and making me shiver. We were standing in a pharmacy parking lot at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, discussing an attempted poisoning as casually as discussing the weather. The fluorescent lights from the pharmacy windows cast everything in harsh relief, making the entire scene feel surreal. "We should go," Nellie said finally, her voice carefully controlled. She was already calculating damage control, figuring out how to manage this disaster. "Ray needs to get home and rest." Rest, as if that was still the primary concern, as if we could all just get back in the car together and pretend that the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. As if the woman who just tried to poison me was still someone I could trust to drive me home safely. But Stephen wasn't finished. "Ray, I have to ask, do you want me to call the police?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that went far beyond my immediate health concerns. Police meant investigations, arrests, family destruction. It meant Paul finding out that his wife had tried to murder his father for inheritance money. Nellie's breathing had become shallow, rapid. The question of police involvement was clearly one she hadn't prepared for. Her plan had probably ended with my death from complications related to my illness. She hadn't considered the possibility of being caught, of having to explain her actions to law enforcement. "I need to think," I said, which was true. My fevered brain was working overtime trying to process not just what had happened, but what needed to happen next. The real medications were in my hands now, the poisoned ones secured by Stephen. I was safe for the moment. But what about tomorrow? Next week? Stephen nodded, understanding. "I'll keep the evidence safe," he said. "Whatever you decide to do, I'll support you." As we walked back toward the Ford, Nellie, myself, and the terrible knowledge that hung between us like smoke, I realized that everything had changed in the span of 5 minutes. The sick old man who'd entered this pharmacy an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly how much danger he was in and exactly who had put him there. Character count 558. The silence in the Ford was absolute, heavy as concrete. Neither of us spoke as Nellie started the engine and backed out of the pharmacy parking lot, the headlights sweeping across the empty asphalt, like searchlights looking for answers. Neither of us was ready to provide. Stephen's revelation had changed everything, but it had changed nothing. We still had to make the 20-minute drive home together. We still had to enter my house together. We still had to figure out what happened next, though I suspected our visions of the future had diverged dramatically in the last 10 minutes. I clutched the bag of real medications in my lap, the white paper crinkling softly with each breath I took. The sound seemed amplified in the car's interior, a rhythmic reminder of how close I'd come to taking whatever poison Nellie had prepared for me. My fever was still raging, my body still weak, but my mind was crystallizing around a single burning truth. Someone I'd trusted, someone I'd cared for, had tried to murder me for money. The route home was identical to our earlier journey, but everything looked different now. The familiar streets of Springfield felt foreign, threatening. Every turn seemed to take us deeper into unknown territory, even though I'd driven these roads for decades. The dashboard lights cast Nellie's profile in green and amber, making her look like a stranger, which I was beginning to realize she had always been. She checked the rear-view mirror compulsively, just as she had during our first trip, but now I understood what she was looking for. Not other cars, but consequences, police lights, evidence, the collapse of whatever future she'd envisioned when she'd learned about my inheritance 3 hours earlier. 3 hours! That's how long it had taken for a family dinner argument to escalate to attempted murder. The timeline was almost impossible to process. the speed with which desperation could transform into lethal action. But then again, desperation was something I was only beginning to understand about Nellie. The pieces were falling into place now, connecting in my fever-addled but increasingly clear mind. Her strange questions about my will weren't casual curiosity. They were reconnaissance. Her sudden concern for my health wasn't belated family feeling. It was opportunity assessment. Everything she'd done since learning about the $650,000 had been calculated, purposeful, aimed at a single goal: accelerating my death and her inheritance. 50,000 in debt. That's what had to be driving this. Whatever financial pressure she was under was severe enough to make murder seem like a reasonable solution. The math was simple from her perspective. My death would eliminate her problems and fund whatever lifestyle she and Paul had been planning. All she had to do was help an old man die a little faster from his illness. Traffic lights passed in a blur of red and green, each one marking our progress toward a house that would never feel safe again. I'd worked 40 years to build something lasting, something valuable to leave behind for my family. Instead, I'd created a motive for my own murder. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. Nellie's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, her breathing shallow and controlled. She was thinking too, calculating just as furiously as I was, but where my thoughts were focused on survival and justice, hers were probably centered on damage control and escape routes. How much did Stephen know? What evidence existed? How much had I figured out? The answer to that last question was everything. Stephen's intervention had connected dots I'd been too sick and too trusting to see on my own. Every strange behavior, every probing question, every moment of false concern now made perfect, horrible sense. Nellie wasn't just greedy, she was dangerous, and she lived in my house, had access to my food, my medicine, my daily routines. We passed the Morrison Auto Shop, where I'd worked for 4 decades, the building dark and silent in the October night. All those years of honest labor, of providing for my family, of building something worth inheriting. And it had led to this moment, in this car, with this woman who'd tried to poison me. The shop's familiar silhouette reminded me of who I'd been before tonight, a man who believed in family, in trust, in doing right by the people you loved. That man was gone now, replaced by someone harder, someone who understood that survival required thinking strategically, not emotionally, someone who realized that 40 years of generosity had been interpreted as weakness, as an invitation to take advantage. 5 blocks from home, I made my decision. Not about Nellie. That decision had been made for me the moment she'd switched my medications, but about myself, about what kind of man I would be going forward. The fever was still burning through my system. My body was still weak, but something essential had crystallized in my mind during this silent drive through familiar streets. I wouldn't be a victim. I wouldn't be the trusting old man who died conveniently, so his family could inherit his life's work. Whatever came next, I would be the one making the decisions, setting the terms, controlling the outcome. Nellie had started this game by trying to kill me for money. Now I would finish it. 3 days of recovery had sharpened my mind like a blade. The fever broke on October 16th, leaving me weak but clear-headed. By the 17th, I could think, without the haze of illness clouding my judgment. Today, October 18th, I drove myself to downtown Springfield, with a purpose that felt as solid as the steering wheel in my hands. The law office of Harrison and Associates sat on Washington Street, tucked between an insurance agency and a small accounting firm. I'd been here before, 4 years ago, when I'd drafted my original will. Back then, I'd been proud to name Paul and Nellie as my beneficiaries, confident I was providing for family who would appreciate my life's work. That man was gone now. In his place sat someone who understood the difference between generosity and stupidity, between family love and survival instinct. The poisoning attempt had burned away 40 years of naive trust, leaving something harder and infinitely more practical. Mr. Harrison looked exactly as I remembered, silver-haired, professionally kind, the sort of lawyer who specialized in wills and estates, rather than courtroom drama. His office smelled of leather-bound books and old wood, the kind of place where important decisions were made quietly and efficiently. Mr. Mills, he said, reviewing my file with practiced ease, I see you'd like to make some changes to your 2020 will. Complete changes, I clarified, settling into the chair across from his desk. Different beneficiaries, entirely. He nodded without surprise. 30 years of estate law had probably shown him every family situation imaginable. I understand. Family circumstances can evolve significantly. Family circumstances. That was one way to describe attempted murder for inheritance money. I pulled out the notes I'd prepared during my recovery, the research I'd done on veterans organizations that could benefit from my life savings. If Paul and Nellie wanted to inherit my money badly enough to poison me for it, they'd have to find a way to kill every veteran in America. The paperwork took an hour to complete. Harrison worked methodically, translating my wishes into legal language that would stand up in any court. Every dollar of my estate, the house worth $450,000, the savings account with $200,000, would go to organizations that helped veterans transition back to civilian life. This completely excludes your previous beneficiaries, Harrison noted as he prepared the signature pages. Paul Mills and Nellie Mills will inherit nothing under this new will. That's exactly what I want. The words felt like victory in my mouth. For 3 days I'd been planning this moment, the surgical removal of their motive for murdering me. They could hardly poison me for money I'd already given away. The signing ceremony was brief but satisfying. Harrison provided the required witnesses, his secretary, and a paralegal who asked no questions about my decision. They watched as I signed my name to each page, officially transferring my life's work from ungrateful family to worthy causes. These documents will be filed immediately, Harrison assured me as I prepared to leave. Your new will is legally binding as of today. The walk to my Ford felt different than the walk into the building an hour earlier. I carried myself straighter, breathed deeper, felt more solid and present in my own skin. The paperwork in my jacket pocket represented more than legal protection. It was proof that I'd reclaimed control over my own life. Starting the engine, I checked my watch. 3 o'clock exactly. Time to drive home and begin the second phase of my plan. The legal groundwork was complete, the inheritance motive eliminated. Now came the personal satisfaction of watching Paul and Nellie realize exactly what their greed had cost them. The drive home took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of anticipation that felt like preparation for battle. But this wasn't a war fought with weapons. This was strategic thinking applied to family betrayal. This was 40 years of hard work protecting itself from those who would exploit it. I pulled into my driveway at 3:20, sat for a moment looking at the house I'd worked so hard to buy and maintain. In a few hours it would be truly mine again, free from ungrateful occupants who'd mistaken my generosity for weakness. The thought brought a smile to my lips, not vindictive, just satisfied. Justice was about to be served. The television was playing some afternoon drama when I walked through my front door, the same mindless entertainment that had been more important than my health 3 nights ago. Paul and Nellie looked up from the couch with expressions that suggested they expected me to announce the results of a routine doctor's visit. "How was your appointment?" Nellie asked, her voice carefully neutral. Since the pharmacy incident, she'd been walking on eggshells, unsure how much I knew or remembered about that night. "Productive." I stood in the doorway, studying them both for what I knew would be the last time. Paul in his usual position, remote control in hand, not a care in the world. Nellie trying to appear casual while her eyes searched my face for clues about my state of mind. "Turn off the television," I said quietly. "We need to talk." Something in my tone made Paul actually reach for the remote without argument. The sudden silence in the room felt heavy, pregnant with the importance of what was about to happen. I remained standing while they stayed seated, a deliberate choice that established the power dynamic from the start. "You have 7 days to leave my house." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of shock across their faces. Paul's mouth opened and closed without sound. Nellie went completely rigid, her face draining of color as she processed what I'd just announced. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Paul found his voice first, confusion and disbelief warring in his expression. "I know about the pill switching at the pharmacy, Nellie. Her face confirmed everything Stephen had told me. Guilt, panic, and calculation flashed across her features in rapid succession as she realized her plan hadn't remained secret after all. Paul turned to stare at his wife, seeing something in her expression that began to tell him a story he didn't want to hear. "What did you want to do? Poison me for 200,000? Ray, I don't know what you think happened, but—" Nellie's voice cracked as she attempted damage control. 650,000, I corrected her. Don't forget the house value. That's what you were willing to kill me for, wasn't it? Paul's head swiveled between his wife and me like he was watching a tennis match played in a foreign language. Will someone please explain what's going on here? So I did. I told him about the night of October 15th, when his fever-racked father had begged for help getting to the pharmacy. I described Nellie's sudden change of heart, her probing questions about my will during the drive, her nervous behavior in the store. I explained about my forgotten wallet, the 3-minute window when I'd left her alone with my medications, and Stephen's intervention based on security camera evidence. With each detail, Paul's face grew paler and more horrified. This wasn't the woman he'd married, or maybe it was exactly the woman he'd married, and he'd been too blind to see it. Nellie sat frozen, unable to deny what Stephen's cameras had recorded, unable to explain away the unexplainable. But why? Paul's question was directed at his wife, his voice barely above a whisper. We're 50,000 in debt, she said finally, the truth spilling out like poison from a broken bottle. Credit cards, medical bills, the loan for my mother's funeral. Ray dies, we inherit everything. All our problems disappear. The casual way she discussed my death, Ray dies, sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with October weather. She'd planned my murder with the same emotional detachment most people use to plan grocery lists. There's one problem with your plan, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket. I changed my will this afternoon. The legal documents rustled as I pulled them out, official and final, and utterly devastating to their carefully calculated future. Every dollar of my estate, the house, the savings, everything, goes to veterans' charities now. You two inherit nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. Paul stared at the papers in my hand like they were poisonous snakes. Nellie made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been something darker. The foundation of their financial future had just crumbled to dust, and they were both smart enough to understand the implications immediately. You have until October 25th to find somewhere else to live, I continued, folding the documents back into my pocket. 7 days should be enough time to pack 3 years of freeloading. Paul opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. What argument could he make? That they deserved to inherit money from the man his wife had tried to murder. That 3 years of rent-free living hadn't been generous enough. That attempted poisoning was somehow excusable because of debt. Nellie finally spoke, her voice small and desperate. Ray, what if I promised never to try murdering me again? I shook my head. That's not a promise anyone should have to make to family. The conversation was over. I delivered the consequences, explained the timeline, and answered their questions. Justice had been served through legal means rather than violence, through strategic thinking rather than emotional revenge. They would leave my house, my life, and my future to people who actually deserved them. Walking toward the stairs, I left them alone to process the ruins of their plans and the reality of their situation. Behind me, I could hear Nellie beginning to cry. Not tears of remorse, but tears of desperation at the complete collapse of her scheme. 7 days. By next Friday, my house would be mine again. The sound of hushed, desperate conversation drifted up from the living room as I sat in my bedroom, giving them time to absorb the full scope of their situation. 3 hours had passed since my announcement. 3 hours for reality to settle in, and for them to understand that their comfortable life in my house was ending. When I came back downstairs at 6 o'clock, I found them surrounded by suitcases and garbage bags, the detritus of 3 years of living, rent-free finally being packed away. Paul moved mechanically, folding clothes with the stunned efficiency of someone in shock. Nellie sat on the floor by the coffee table, crying quietly as she wrapped dishes in newspaper. The speed of their capitulation surprised me. I'd expected arguments, negotiations, desperate attempts to change my mind. Instead, they'd accepted defeat, with the weary resignation of people who understood exactly how thoroughly they'd destroyed their own future. "We'll need until tomorrow morning to finish packing," Paul said without looking at me. His voice was flat, empty of the casual entitlement that had characterized our relationship for years. "That's fine." I watched him fold the shirts I'd bought him last Christmas, watched Nellie pack the cookware she'd used to prepare meals with my groceries. Everything in this house bore the fingerprints of my generosity, and now it was all being packed away by the people who'd tried to murder me for more. Nellie looked up from her packing, her face streaked with tears and makeup. "Ray, please don't report me to the police." The request hung in the air between us, loaded with implications about prison sentences and criminal records and futures destroyed by legal consequences. She was asking for mercy from the man she'd tried to poison, forgiveness from the target of her attempted murder. "I won't report you," I said finally, "but I won't forgive you either." It was the truth, simply stated. Involving the police would mean trials and testimony and months of reliving the horror of discovering that family could be more dangerous than strangers. But forgiveness was something else entirely, a gift that required trust, and trust was something Nellie had poisoned as surely as she'd tried to poison my antibiotics. They finished packing in silence after that, moving through my house like ghosts, gathering the remnants of a life that had never really belonged to them. Paul avoided my eyes, shame and guilt written across his features in permanent marker. Nellie packed methodically, efficiently, like someone who'd already moved on to planning whatever came next. By 7:30, 5 suitcases and 3 boxes represented the entirety of their 3-year residency in my home. Not much to show for 1,000 days of free housing, free utilities, free groceries, but then again they'd never contributed anything meaningful to the household, just consumed resources and plotted murder when the free ride wasn't generous enough. "Where will you go?" I asked as Paul loaded the last box into his finally repaired car. "Nellie's sister in Chicago," he said without enthusiasm, "at least until we figure something else out." Chicago, 5 hours away, far enough that they'd be completely out of my life, close enough that they could build something new if they chose to. Though given Nellie's $50,000 in debt and Paul's employment history, something new would probably involve a lot more work and a lot less comfort than they were accustomed to. They stood by their car as the October evening settled around us, 2 people who'd gambled everything on inherited money and lost completely. Paul looked back at the house one last time, perhaps remembering happier moments from his childhood, perhaps just mourning the security he was leaving behind. Nellie didn't look back at all. She'd already moved on, already started calculating new angles and new opportunities. The woman who tried to poison me for inheritance money wasn't the type to waste time on regret or reflection. She was the type to find another victim, another mark, another source of easy money. "Goodbye, Dad," Paul said quietly, and I heard genuine sadness in his voice, not for what he'd done, but for what he'd lost. Not regret for enabling his wife's murder attempt, but grief for the comfortable life that was ending. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to either of them, no wisdom to impart or forgiveness to offer. They'd made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. I'd made mine too, to protect myself, to reclaim my life, and to ensure that my 40 years of honest work would benefit people who actually deserved it. Their car pulled out of my driveway at 8 o'clock exactly, disappearing into the October darkness like a bad dream finally ending. I stood at my front window watching the taillights fade, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace in my own home. The house felt different immediately, not empty but clean, not lonely but private. For the first time in 3 years, every room belonged entirely to me. Every decision about meals, television shows, temperature, and daily routine would be mine alone. The freedom was intoxicating. Tomorrow I'd call my doctor and schedule the European vacation I'd been postponing for years. Maybe Ireland, maybe Scotland. Somewhere green and peaceful where old men could walk ancient paths and remember what it felt like to trust the world around them. Tonight I'd sleep in my own house, surrounded by my own things, safe from family members who'd confused generosity with opportunity. Justice had been served, not through violence or revenge, but through the simple application of strategic thinking to personal protection. I was 68 years old, and I had just learned the most important lesson of my life. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who call you family. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching,